Hey everyone, we're looking at Exploring World History, lesson number 24. It's the story of Ruth. Just kind of as an introduction, the book of Ruth tells us the beautiful story of King David's ancestors. Ruth gives us a glimpse of everyday life during this time period. And the main idea is that as Boaz was the kinsman redeemer for Ruth, God is the redeemer of Israel. This story starts with Elimelech and Naomi. Okay, they were husband and wife. They were living in Israel. They have two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And like I said, they're living in Israel when famine comes. Okay, there's a bad famine. They're struggling to survive, literally. And Elimelech decides to move his family to Moab. It's about 50 miles east of where Israel is at this point. Okay. They hope to survive as economic refugees. So once they get to Moab, they're living in Moab, they're trying to survive, and the two sons marry two different women, Orpah and Ruth. Eventually, as tragedies occur and they're trying to survive and things happen and there's lots of people who are not surviving and not making it, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies, and then eventually both her sons die as well. And this causes a problem because back then, especially you were, as women, required to have some type of man take care of you. So if her husband died, her sons would have been responsible for taking care of her, and so on. So this leaves Naomi, a widowed Israelite woman with two widowed Moabite daughters-in-law in a foreign land with no one to provide for her. So Naomi's trying to figure out, what do I do at this point? And she thinks probably the best case scenario for her is to return to Israel and hope one of her relatives, distant relatives, will find a way to provide for her. So she decides she's going to return to Bethlehem. And the daughters-in-law are both saying, oh, we're going to go with you, we'll go with you, we're going to stay with you. However, Naomi encourages them both to leave her and stay in Moab. She says, according to the Israeli traditions, somebody would have to marry you. You're better off just to stay here because I can't produce any more sons. I'm too old. I don't know of any really close relatives that were willing to do this. So it's better off if you just stay here in Moab. Orpah grudgingly gives in and says, okay, and she leaves and stays in Moab. However, Ruth absolutely refuses and says that she's going to stick with Naomi forever. And if that means they die together, they're going to die together. That's what Ruth decides. So Naomi and Ruth go back to Bethlehem, and after Naomi's been gone for 10 years, but as she gets there, she's recognized by some of the people, and they said, and Naomi basically says, "My name is no longer Naomi." Naomi meant pleasant. She said instead call her Morka, which means bitter, and claimed to have lost all of God's blessings. She was struggling at this time. She lost her husband. She lost her sons. She has no way of providing for herself, and she's just probably scared and sad and lonely. And at this point, Ruth has gone with her, and she's decided, let me find a way to try to provide for her and Naomi. Well, under Israeli law, as the workers cleared fields, they were required to leave a little bit so that, the lesser people, the people who are lesser off, who are poor, had the ability to glean from the fields and survive. And so this is what Ruth does, and just by chance, she winds up in the fields of a man named Boaz. And Boaz is a very large landowner, a very big businessman, and he sees Ruth and basically tells his worker, take care of her, make sure she has enough and extra, and do what needs to be done so she can glean enough to make bread for her and Naomi. Eventually, they find out that Boaz and Naomi are relatives that are, very distant relatives. And so Naomi tells Ruth to lay down at his feet one night while they're in the harvest, and he's out there protecting his harvest. And this says Naomi tells Ruth, it shows that she wants to marry him, and that eventually he basically agrees. According to custom and law, there's different things that had to happen. So Boaz starts negotiating with the relatives, and there was one person who was more closely related, and this person had basically the first right to remarry and take possession of whatever these Naomi's family had at the point. So Boaz goes to him and basically says, do you want this? And the person refuses. So Boaz gets permission to marry Ruth rather. So then they marry, and the Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot more about them, but there's a couple things we know. There is a connection to David. Okay, Boaz and Ruth have a son. Only one son that we are aware of, and his name is Obed, which means the servant of the Lord. Obed fathers Jesse, and Jesse fathers David. So Ruth was David's great-grandmother. Okay? So ultimately, out of this story of Ruth, we go from kind of a tragedy to a blessing. And again, it shows how that Boaz was the kinsman redeemer for Ruth, and God is the redeemer of Israel. And he shows that redeemer through David and his lineage all the way down through Christ, okay? Your book talks about a few other things that are going on during this time period where Ruth and Naomi are struggling and going back to Bethlehem. And so I'm just going to kind of quickly look at some things on page 120 of your book of what else was happening during this time period, okay? The Olmec civilization developed along the Gulf of Mexico. These people were creative artists, as evidenced by the many different types of sculptures that have survived. Also, the Minoan Palace in Knossos in Crete was a sprawling complex with hundreds of rooms. More likely a religious center than a palace, it had an elaborate water drainage system, including toilets and extensive storage facilities. Number 3, it says the Battle of Kadesh took place about 1275 BC between Egyptian and Hittite armies. It involved some 30,000 men and a few thousand chariots. The Egyptians claimed victory, but they ended up retreating. The 4th is the Vedas are foundational religious text for Hinduism. Their hymns, sacrificial ceremonies, chants, and magical medical rituals. The material eventually began to be collected during this period, and followers memorized the information and passed it down from one generation to the next. Lastly, in China, the Qing dynasty is flourishing. Tens of thousands of so-called oracle bones were discovered, and questions were written on bones or shells in an appeal for dead ancestors to give guidance. Okay? So that's some of the other things that were just kind of going on at the same time as the story of Ruth, so we can try to just connect the whole world together and see a little glimpse of what's going on. Thanks.